I'm Andrew Gibson, and I'm a director of the Chichester Ship Canal Trading Company. The Chichester Ship Canal, a story of aspiration. Why was it built in the first place? Bankruptcy. It was a complete and utter failure commercially, often referred to as the Waterway of Woe. And finally, success, because it's now going through probably the most successful period in its 200-year history. So let's first of all think, why was it built? Now, the Chichester Canal, you've got a little canal which is the pimple under the word Chichester, which is the canal going into Chichester. And that joins onto the Portsmouth to Arundel Canal, which went from virtually the centre of Portsmouth Dockyard, all the way over to Arundel. Why were these canals built? If you go back to Roman times, the canal into Chichester, or the port for Chichester, would have been Appledram. This, by the Middle Ages, had moved to Delquey, and it was quite a profitable little port with about 4,000 tonnes a year going through it. By the 1800s, 18,000 tonnes a year went through the little port of Appledram. But it was a very shallow water port. And even as far back as 1585, an Act of Parliament was passed to build a canal between Chichester and the sea. No one's quite sure where it went. Perhaps it might just have followed the River Lower, but nothing ever happened. The problem with Delquey was that if you had anything heavy, such as a load of coal, it would go to Portsmouth. Then it would be transshipped and sent to Itchenor. Then it would be transshipped yet again into a little coastal collier and sent to Delquey. And then it would be transshipped and come in on the toll road to Chichester. And the roads in Sussex at that time were called the worst roads in the country. So by the 1800s, you could probably justify a canal going into Chichester from the sea. The tonnage would be enough. But you couldn't really justify it unless it joined on to something else, a network. And the part of the network that is relevant is the canal that went all the way from Portsmouth to Arundel. Why was that built? Well, the short answer is the Navy. The Navy, back in the Middle Ages, realised they had a problem transshipping material down to Portsmouth. If you went in with a horse and cart, 6 horses, and a wagon, probably that would do about 10 miles in a day. If you had something heavy, like a cannon coming down from Woolwich Arsenal, that with a 16 oxen train could take 18 months to 2 years to come all the way down from London. So it's not surprising that most goods to Portsmouth from London came by sea. And the sea passage was dangerous. You had the Dutch, the Spanish, the French taking pot shots at you, and you had a fairly dangerous sea crossing with the Dogger Bank, Goodwin Sands, and coming along the south coast. But by 1800, there was 80,000 tonnes a year of naval traffic coming down from London to Portsmouth. So you could, in theory, justify a canal going all the way from London to Portsmouth. And the first part that was built opened in about 1650 and was a widening of the River Way. It came down from Shepperton on the Thames and came down to Guildford. That opened in the 1650s, and it immediately had a very profitable beginning, because a few years later you had the Great Fire of London in 1666, and there was that canal all ready to ship building materials and timber into London. We then, in typical British fashion, really ended up in a period when nothing much happened. It took 100 years for a small canal to open up going into Godalming, but we were in the middle of the canal building era, and there were proposals for canals to come down from Basingstoke, from Reading, from Croydon. They even proposed a horse-drawn railway to come down all the way from Croydon. And in 1802, the Chichester, the Portsmouth to London Canal Company was formed, and they engaged a man called John Rennie as a consulting engineer. Rennie was a really important engineer. He was up there with Brunel and Telford. He'd already built the Kennet and Avon Canal. He had done a lot of work in Portsmouth Dockyard, Chatham Dockyard, and he built Waterloo Bridge, which is the first bridge with elliptical arches, which enabled you to have a flat road going over the top rather than a humpback bridge. He was pretty expensive. He cost £1,200 a day. So you would have thought they would have made use of him. He came up with designs in 1805. He came up with another one in 1806. He came up with another design in 1810. And absolutely nothing happened with any of those designs. Interestingly, one of the designs called for Langstone Harbour to be a mercantile port. And that would have enabled Portsmouth to be solely a naval port. And it is interesting to sort of think about what would happen. Would Langstone Harbour have been the Southampton of the south coast? Meanwhile, the digging of the canal coming down from Guildford, that was continuing apace. And in 1816, the final section was opened, which was the Way and Arun Canal. And this meant that you could now go all the way from London, all the way down to the south coast. And at that time, someone should really have said, this is 1816, do we really need to go any further? We can now come all the way down to the coast. We can send a little coaster along to Portsmouth. But no, almost as a fait accompli, the Portsmouth to London Canal Company called back John Rennie, and in 1816, very quickly, he proposed the line of the current canal, which went straight across the country, bypassing Chichester, entering Langstone Harbour, around Hayling Island, around Thorney Island, into Portsmouth at Milton, and then into the land port area of Portsmouth. An Act of Parliament was passed giving authority to raise £125,000. 80% of this was raised even before royal assent was given to this Act, and £20,000 was raised in Portsmouth within about 4 days. The main backer was Lord Egremont of Petworth, and Lord Egremont guaranteed £20,000. Building started in 1818, and immediately Chichester Council said, we don't like this canal. This is a normal canal which is going to be 4 foot 6 deep. We want a canal where we can bring in coastal boats full of coal because we are building a gasworks in Chichester Basin. So it was agreed that the canal from Portsmouth into Chichester would be built to a depth of 8 foot. Instead of the normal 4 foot 6 deep. In 1822, the first part of the canal opened, and that was the section into Chichester. It didn't have a very auspicious opening. 3 boatloads of dignitaries were being transported across Langstone Harbour, being towed by a little steam tug, and they went aground, and they stayed aground, and they missed all the celebrations. The final section of the canal, which went from Hunston to Ford to join up with the canal to London, opened 1 year later in 1823. So we were now ready. We could go all the way from London into the land port area of Portsmouth with naval stores. The estimate was that of the 80,000 tonnes of stores coming down, they would be able to get at least 50% of that on the canal. 1824, 1 year after opening, that was the best year ever. and they carried a total of just under 4,000 tonnes. Most of it came down from London, about 2,500 tonnes. About 1,100 tonnes went up from the Chichester and the South Coast area, and that was mainly eggs and a bit of bullion, but their total tonnage of 4,000 compared to their estimate of 55,000 tonnes. So they were in dire financial straits. By the end of 1824, that's 1 year after the canal opened, they were bankrupt. The government gave them a loan of £40,000, which Lord Egremont had to guarantee. And 2 years later, in 1826, Lord Egremont just walked away. He gave up the rights to his shares, he paid off the £40,000 loan that he guaranteed, and he probably lost the equivalent in today's terms of about £8 million. Traffic from London carried on, but by 1827, that's only 4 years after it opened, it was virtually non-existent. And by the 1830s, really London traffic ceased altogether. The pumping station at Ford, because there was no traffic, was shut down, and this meant that the section between Ford and Hunston, just south of Chichester, started to dry up very rapidly. And in the 1850s, the Way and Arun Canal, which was really the raison d'etre for taking the canal all the way into Portsmouth, that shut down. The link into Chichester went on to 1906, mainly bringing in gravel and shingle and taking out horse manure. Why did it fail so catastrophically and so quickly? Well, first of all, of course, when they actually built the canal, the political situation changed. Napoleon had been beaten, we'd gone past Trafalgar, and we had gone past Waterloo. So the political necessity for the canal, that had gone. Freight from London to Portsmouth came down to about 10 shillings a tonne. Canal freight rates were only 9 shillings a tonne, but dues were levied on every section of the canal that people went through. Every landowner expected his remuneration. And by the time they had added on all of these fees, freight by canal cost 22 and sixpence a tonne. So it was not economic. Portsmouth was a naval port and not a mercantile port. There was no return traffic. Another factor to bear in mind, if you are building a canal, you only build locks which are as large as the smallest lock on the canal. The smallest lock on the canal was the first one built, which was at Godalming. It was only about 70 feet long. Why then build a lock coming out of Portsmouth, which was over 100 feet long? There was no way that you were going to have vessels that long on the canal. The other aspect was the Portsea Canal. Coming in from Milton, the Portsea Canal leaked, and it leaked to the extent that it was contaminating the water supply in Portsmouth. And only 2 years after it opened, the Portsea Canal was closed down. Another factor, of course, was that the building costs got completely out of control. Purely on a verbal basis, the building work went ahead, and the costs came as quite a surprise to the directors. The building costs in total were about £50,000 over their original estimate of £120,000. And another factor, of course, was the need to pump water into the canal every time the tide went out at Arundel, and that was an expensive operation. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. The directors had their last board meeting in the 1850s, and then everything went quiet. Suddenly in the 1890s, people realised that they might actually be sitting on an asset that had some value, the land asset. So a winding up petition was presented, and Chichester Council immediately objected because they wanted the canal into Chichester to remain open for their gasworks. It was agreed that the winding up order could proceed without the Chichester element, and all the shareholders received about £2.11 for the £50 shares that they had bought about 60 years earlier. In 1906, as I say, the last load came into Chichester, and this canal then completely shut down. It was then owned by Portsmouth, by Chichester Council, and they retained ownership until it was finally bought by West Sussex County Council, and they, in the 1970s, leased it to the Chichester Canal Society. You now see a view of Chichester with the gasworks to which the coal is delivered, and that was quite a significant tonnage. About 1,800 tonnes a year came into Chichester Gasworks. On the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a small house. That is the custom officer's house, because goods came in straight from overseas in coastal-going vessels. On the right-hand side of the road, you can see another little cottage. That was the port officer's house. Unfortunately, it's no longer there. The boats that came into Chichester were sailing boats, and that is the reason why all the bridges on this section would be swing bridges, so that they don't have to take the masts down. Generally 100 to 150 ton barges. And that is sailing on a section of the canal which is still open today. Halfway down the canal is the abutments remaining of a tramway which went from Chichester to Selsey. In the 1880s, you obtained a license for a tramway, and as soon as you received this license, you then put a formal train onto the lines. This line went on to the 1930s, when it was killed off by the bus. It was a really amateurish operation. Every time the driver and the fireman got to the bridge, they got out. One stood one side of the bridge, one stood the other. They both wound it up. If they wound it up at different speeds, the bridge twisted and everything came to a halt. That is the entrance into Chichester, with the view of the cathedral in the distance, and you can see there on the right-hand side the little customs house. Interesting to know that even in those days, the canal had a problem with weed. Turner painted the picture of the Chichester Canal in 1828. He was sponsored by Lord Egremont. The original picture is in the Tate Gallery with a copy in Petworth House. And with a bit of artistic license, Turner has painted it with the sun setting in the north, with a boat going down the canal, which is far too big for the canal, and with the bell tower of the cathedral on the wrong side of the spire. Interesting point is, with this being painted in 1828, this was 2 years after Lord Egremont had had to pay back the £40,000 loan to the government, and you would have thought the last thing he would have wanted was a painting to remind him of Chichester Cathedral. There is one of the swing bridges. This is the only swing bridge that remains. It's just outside Chichester, and it is swung every year when we engage in dragon boat racing on the canal. Interesting point on this one, the A27 Chichester Bypass Bridge, which is usually a traffic jam. The future of the canal came up to a lot of discussion, and there was even thought that the basin at Chichester could be turned into an underground car park, and the canal itself could be made into a route down to the coast. This didn't happen. Chichester Council were very enlightened, and they insisted that instead of a culvert being built at the A27, they wanted access for the canal to be maintained, and they insisted that a bridge should be built. West Sussex County Council purchased it in 1956 from the City Council, and they are still currently the only owners. They're currently the owners. In World War II, the Admiralty requisitioned the canal, and they installed a dam in the Chichester Marina to increase the water depth because they wanted to use it as a tank trap in case we were invaded. Unfortunately, the effect of this dam was to increase the depth of the water in the surrounding area to the extent that it caused flooding. Chichester Council opened up the lock gate into the sea, left it open, and the whole canal drained out into the sea, marooning all of the boats that were being built in the marina area. That is the history. That is really why it failed. But today it is a thriving canal, and we would really welcome you to come and visit us.